Welcome to episode 6 in a series where we're going through this book, Logical Chess, move by move. And let's jump right into the questions that were asked from the previous episode. So, first questions from Jack Does Puzzles. He said, and by the way, this was the position that we talked about last time. And right at this moment, Black castled. Oops, sorry, let me select the board here. Black castled. And we started throwing our pawns forward, gaining tempo by chasing Black's knights around. Okay, the knight had to move. We did it again, chased the other knight around. And Jack Does Puzzles asked the question right here, aren't we at risk of overextending our pawns? We're pushing them too far, too fast, too far forward. Should we be worried about that? And the answer is no, we should not be worried about that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, they're very well defended. This is defended, this is defended, this is defended. And they're not really attacked that much, right? There's only there's an attack here, but this knight has to move, so that attack goes away. So there's really only one piece attacking them. So they're not really being attacked. And the fact that we're gaining tempo and gaining space, like we're opening up these spaces for our pieces to use if they need to or if they want to, that is huge. That is really, really good. And the center pawns are very different from the side pawns, right? Like if I castle over here and then start moving these pawns forward, yes, absolutely, I'm overextending. I'm creating weaknesses around my king. But in this case, this is just the center of the board. I've got total control over that because of my pieces anyway. I'm totally happy doing this so that we're not at risk of overextending. So hopefully that makes sense as to why it's okay to do this, okay? Second part of Jack Does Puzzles question came a little bit later. After Queen C2, if Black played, not this one, if Black played Knight to C5, I had mentioned that we would play Knight to G5 and threaten checkmate, go on the offensive, and this was a really good move. And his question was, well, what about A3 instead? Because if the bishop goes back, we get a fork. And if the bishop trades for our knight after A3, well, we're happy because we got the bishop pair. And you're not wrong. That's an okay idea, but it's not nearly as good as the threat over here because now Black can play D6. And they've got time to get their bishop out. They're going to finish developing. It's a pretty equal position, actually. Going back to Knight to G5 immediately puts the pressure on, and Black doesn't have time to develop the bishop. Notice how we stop them from completing their development by creating a more powerful threat over here. Okay. The other thing that I would say is if this pin was like really, really bothering you or like really preventing you from doing something super important and you just couldn't do it, because the pin, okay, then maybe you should take time to chase the bishop away and force an issue and get rid of the pin. But in this position, this knight doesn't really matter that much. We've got the huge pawn center controlling all this stuff. We've got the bishop in a good place. We've got the knight ready to go. We've got the queen ready to go. We can even use the h-pawn like we ended up seeing later in the game, right? All of this stuff can happen regardless of if this knight is pinned or not. Right? It doesn't really matter. So I'm not going to waste my time playing a move like A3. Usually you only want to play moves like A3 and H3. If you really, really, really have no other options, you have to get rid of that pin immediately because it's just going to cause you like massive problems. Sometimes that's the case, but usually not. In this case, it's not. Okay? So that's the answer to the question. Knight G5 is just better for those reasons. And then the next question I want to answer was from somebody, user FV3YD5ZS7J. And they asked the question later in the game. Not this line. Sorry, let's go back to the main line here. Takes. We attacked. H4, H6. Right here, I said the best move was D6. Because it unleashed the bishop, and we saw what happened in the game. White went on to get checkmate. The question was, well, instead of D6, isn't H5 better? Because we're attacking the knight here. And if Black were to, let's say, take us, we would take back, and we have a killer attack. We're going to take here, and we've got the queen, and we've got the rook. Isn't this better? And the answer is no. It's not better. It's a good move. And if you didn't have D6, then yes, I would probably consider H5 as being maybe the next best move. But the reason why it's not as good is watch what can happen here. After H5, Black can actually play D6, so they stop you from doing that. You can't unleash your bishop anymore. Yes, you get a piece, but they're going to take back here. Now look what's happened. The rook is unleashed. There's a bishop lined up here as well, so you have to watch out for that. Your knight is also under attack, so you have to kind of think, do you want to sack the knight? Do you want to defend this? What do you want to do? It's very easy to go wrong here and play the wrong move. And it turns out that this position is just not as strong as the other one. And you might say, well, queen takes g6, I'm coming in here, isn't this really good? And actually, watch this. Bishop takes f2 check. You got to move your king somewhere. And then there's this move, bishop f5, defending, attacking the queen and defending the checkmate at the same time. Very, very powerful move. And all of a sudden, it's kind of like an equal position, actually. Black has lots of compensation. So it just goes to show, like, when you allow the pieces to get into the game, the things that could happen, right? Going back to the main line, we played d6, which basically cemented the fact that this bishop is stuck. This bishop cannot come into the game. There's no way. You can't even move the pawn to let it out, right? And that was just so much more powerful than h5. So hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, if we didn't have the option to play d6 for whatever reason, like maybe this pawn was already here and we had to find a move to play, then yeah, maybe you would consider h5. But in this case, d6 was just too powerful. Okay? So I hope that makes sense and answers some questions. Good questions. Thank you guys for asking those. And let's go ahead now and jump in game number 6. All right, so here we go. This is page 39 for those of you following along in the book. And here we go. So e4, e5. And actually, I think this game I do want to look at from Black's perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the board around here. So e4, e5, knight to f3. And I thought this was funny. One of the things he says is, you can play this move confidently, secure in the knowledge that no master alive can make a better move. So I always think it's funny when I learn like an opening line that I've studied with Stockfish or something, and you absolutely know the best move in the position, and you can just play it knowing that like even Magnus Carlsen couldn't play a better move. That's kind of a cool feeling. I don't recommend that you go memorize a whole bunch of openings, but that was just something that I did think about. All right, knight c6 defends the pawn. Bishop to b5. This is the Rui Lopez, very common opening here. And it's a common misconception that white is actually threatening to take here and win a pawn. And so one of the main lines is a6, and it's actually not a free pawn for white because there's a move Black has here. If you would like to pause, you got a chance to look at that. It's queen to d4. It's a simple fork, and Black's going to get the pawn back with check and an attack on the king. And so you don't actually have to worry about losing a pawn. I just wanted to point that out because a lot of people think that you do. Okay. So let's keep going here. Black plays a very aggressive move, f5. This is the Jaenisch Gambit. So it's similar to the Latvian Gambit, which is an opening that I used to play quite a bit. Now, the Latvian Gambit would happen immediately, and you wouldn't play the knight c6 and bishop to b5. So it's kind of a similar idea, but you delay a little bit here in this case. And if you're a beginner, you have to be careful playing a move like this because you do open up this diagonal. Sorry, right here, this diagonal. You also open up this one, and you have to kind of know what you're doing. But at the same time, it gives you opportunities to put the pressure on your opponent, and they need to know what they're doing, or they can get into trouble as well. So it really goes both ways. Okay, white plays d4, which is a very aggressive approach, and there's nothing wrong with that if they know what they're doing. F takes e4, knight takes e5, and I wanted to point out a line here that is very, very common. Now, this is a critical moment in the game, okay? And if you're an e4, e5 player, and the f pawn is ever moved forward, you always have to consider what happens when a knight jumps into e5. And the big threat is queen to h5. And these usually go hand in hand at the same time, right? Because when the knight lands on e5, it also unleashes the queen, which now can go to h5. And the reason this is so dangerous is, for example, if Black is not paying attention and just plays a random move like d5, queen h5 check is immediately a very annoying move. Because if you play g6, there's the sacrifice, and then your rook is hanging. Okay. Also, white could just take here and just keep attacking your king. However you look at it, it's not good. And if you try to just run, you're going to get checkmated instead. Queen here. Let's see, what's the move? Knight c4 takes, bishop f4, knight e5, checkmate. Okay, so there you go. So you have to be super, super careful. So if you're playing this as Black, you got to watch out for queen h5. And if you're playing from white's perspective, you want to remember that this is a very powerful move that you have if Black lets you. Okay, let me go back to Black's perspective. But in the game, Black does a nice job of going ahead and trading that knight, getting rid of that. And now it's not so dangerous, right? Because now you could play g6 because the knight can no longer take. Now, there are situations where even that can be dangerous if the queen can go there because there's like a follow-up fork. But in this case, the pawn is there, so it's not as big of a deal. But these are the things that you want to think about if you're going to be playing these super aggressive openings with f5. Okay, let's keep going. So knight takes 5, d takes e5, and then here Black plays the move c6. And he talks about this in the book, and I want to reiterate this because this is really important. One of the principles that we talk about is don't make too many pawn moves in the opening and get your pieces out early. And here we see black making a pawn move, right? So he mentions in the book several reasons why this is okay. But in my opinion, number 2, the time lost in moving the pawn is compensated for by the fact that the bishop must also lose a move in retreating. This is critical. It's not really wasting time moving pawns if you're attacking pieces, because now you're forcing white to move a piece multiple times in the opening, which is also something that they're not supposed to do. So it kind of balances out. Okay, so it's very different than if I'm just like, I'll just play like h6 or b6 or e3 or these moves that don't really have a threat. c6 has a threat, and believe it or not, it's creating this queen a5 check threat, which is actually a pretty significant thing in the position, okay? And we'll talk more about that in just a second. So let's keep going. So he plays c6, bishop retreats, and then queen a5 check. Now, another principle that you've probably heard is don't bring out the queen too early, right? And we're seeing that here. Why? What should we be doing here as black? Trying to develop our pieces. But can we develop very many pieces? Well, this bishop is stuck. This knight would like to go to f6, but it can't. If we try to push the pawn forward, we're going to get en passanted, right? The special pawn move in chess. And now this is an annoying pawn in our face. So I guess you could argue that the only piece we could really develop would be the bishop. But then we have to be careful. There's actually some tactics here, which this is a bit advanced to see. But the point is you're getting into trouble, right? Because you only have really 1 or 2 developing moves that maybe you could consider. So this pawn on e5, maybe you noticed this or maybe not, but this pawn on e5 is really the big problem in black's position because it stops the knight, because it prevents us from playing d5 because of en passant. It's just like super annoying. This pawn is like, we have to get rid of this pawn. So that's why we're breaking the rules and playing queen h5 check. Okay, sorry about that, because we need to get rid of this guy. Okay, so I hope that you can understand, like, yes, you want to follow the principles most of the time, but when you have these critical moments where it's like, something is going on here that's more important than the principles, you have to make the exception. Okay, knight to c3, queen takes d5. Now, it's more important than just like black won a pawn. It's like, hey, now our pieces can develop. Now we can play d5 and there's no en passant, and we have this amazing pawn chain. All of this stuff starts to fit together. All right, that's why that was such a big deal. Okay, and here white castles. Now, we've seen a lot about castling in this series so far, and it's no exception here again, where castling is not the greatest move. He says in the book, plausible and bad. It was more discreet to conceal his intentions. So sometimes castling gets you into more trouble than it's worth if you're castling into an attack. And also, if you remember back to the very start of this book, what was the first thing that he said about castling? What weakens the castled position? There was 2 things. Number 1, if you've moved a pawn in front of the castled king, which white has not done, so it's not that. But the second reason was if the knight on f3 is gone, it's easier to attack the king, right? And then guess what? The knight on f3 is gone. So white, knowing that, should have been more cautious and should have said, hold on, do I really want to castle here at this moment in time? Okay. I wrote my own personal note here. Like, when you castle, that's the only time in chess when you can move the king 2 spaces at the same time. It significantly moves the position of the king, right? Normally kings just move 1. When you castle, it moves 2. So it's like you go from being in the center of the board to the side of the board, and you could go either side. So you want to make sure that you're using that move wisely and not putting your king into more danger. Okay, let's keep going. So d5, fantastic move. Again, it's a pawn move, but it's with a tempo. So it's like almost like a free move, which is great. It lets the bishop out. It creates this amazing pawn chain. This amazing pawn chain where everything is defended, and just controlling lots of squares defends here. Just a super great move. All right, so d5, bishop goes back. Knight to f6. Again, remember we talked about the e5 pawn. Now that it's gone, black can put the knight on a very nice square where it would like to be. Bishop to e3 and bishop to d6. Now, this is an important move, okay? Of course, it's threatening checkmate, which is good. But black's intention is not, well, I hope that white doesn't notice it and then I get checkmate the next move. What he's really thinking is white's going to see it, but how's he going to deal with it? The knight is gone that's supposed to be defending that. So he's probably got to play a move like g3. But guess what? Now you've moved a pawn in front of the king, and we know what that means. Creates weaknesses. So that's the whole point behind what black is trying to do here. Okay? And I believe that is what we see in the game. Yeah, g3. And then I highlighted this. Black starts an attack using his pieces rather than trying to break into the position by the pawn assault. And yeah, this is important because a lot of people, I think, might get confused here. So you could try to attack by playing h5 and h4 and using your pawns. But when you see specific weaknesses, okay, usually it's better to just try to attack those straight away. h5, h4 doesn't really take advantage of those specific weaknesses. So what black does instead is uses his pieces, and he had the bishop that needed to be developed anyway, and it's with a tempo, and it's specifically taking advantage of those weak squares. That's why bishop g4 and attacking with the pieces made so much more sense in this situation than using the pawn. And sometimes it would be different. Sometimes, like we actually saw a game last week where the best way to attack was throwing that h-pawn forward, right? Because it was what the position needed. You needed that h-pawn. Remember the other game we looked at? There was like a knight blocking the queen. Remember that? And we had to chase it away with the h-pawn. This is kind of a different situation. And so here, the bishop infiltrating is the best way. All right? So bishop g4. By the way, if you're not familiar with the term holes in chess, this is a hole and this is a hole because the pawn can no longer defend it. So any squares where no pawns can control are considered holes. And those are nice squares for your pieces, your knights and your bishops, because they can't be chased away, okay? Like anywhere else that's not a hole, it could easily be chased away by a pawn. In this case, it can't. So that's why it's such a good deal. All right, let's keep going. Bishop g4, the queen moves. The bishop infiltrates, and you can see how powerful this is, right? Look at this. The king has nowhere to move. It's already starting to lose its options because this annoying bishop, all right? There's really not much. Even at this point, the game is basically already over. It's just a question of can black finish it off. And I say it's over. I think a lot of people here would mess this up. I think a lot of people would think, okay, my queen's under attack, and I have to be careful where I move because if I move somewhere like this, I lose a bishop. I don't want to lose a bishop. So probably need to move somewhere that defends the bishop, maybe like here or here, and then I need to trade. I think maybe 80% of the people watching this video would think that way. Here's what you need to understand. Here's what you need to understand. When you look at this position as a whole, what is the most important thing in the position? This and this and this king and the weaknesses that are right here and the power of this bishop and how it's defended and how it can't be moved. That's the most important thing. So if I know that that's the most important thing, then I can understand that, like, hey, saving this bishop is not the most important thing. Now, this is counterintuitive, right? Because when you first learn chess, it's like, hey, don't blunder your pieces. Don't lose a bishop for free, which is good. You want to think that way. But you need to learn as you get better, like, hey, normally I would save my bishop, but normally I don't have the opportunity to go checkmate the king with my queen. So in this position, forget the bishop. I'm going for the checkmate. And it's important that white has no way to stop you. If they had a way to stop you, well, then you would probably save the bishop, okay? So do you guys see how I'm arriving at that? And that is why the move is queen f5. Okay, knight comes back, trying desperately to get the knight here to defend. And it's just a little bit too late. Queen h3. Remember we talked about the holes? And the fact that that pawn has been moved forward, and look at how black is taking advantage of that. There's no pawn controlling these, okay? Knight to e3, and if you haven't read the book and you want to try to find the finishing blow here, what's the move that you need to play now? Because white has done a nice job of defending the checkmate threat. So how do you kind of finish off the game here? All right, and if you had a chance to look at that, the move is knight to g4, and it's a very nice move for two reasons. Number one, you have a new checkmate threat here on h2 that white can't really deal with, and if they try to take your knight to get rid of that, well, then it no longer defends the g2 checkmate, and you could simply go there. And so it's basically over what happened in the game. White tried to make room for the king to run, but unfortunately, after check and the queen died, it's just checkmate. There's nowhere for the king to go. So a couple of critical things here. We saw how black kind of broke some opening principles, actually quite a few, because there were specific reasons, right? So for example, right here, broke the principles of not developing quickly, made some pawn moves because he needed to get rid of this annoying pawn, brought the queen out early, again, because he needed to get rid of that annoying pawn, and then he was able to continue following the principles. Now you can finish the development, get the knight out, get the bishop out. Also paying attention to the weaknesses on the king side. The knight is not there, so he's forcing some sort of weakening move, and then again taking advantage of that. And the final kind of moment of not following the principle of, hey, don't blunder a bishop. Well, I'm going to blunder my bishop here because I'm going to go get checkmate. Not a blunder, obviously, but you get what I'm saying. So super nice game, very instructive. Hope you guys learned something from that. Let me know, questions, comments. Next game is game number 7, which starts on page 43. I'm excited. I'll see you guys next Friday. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care. Oh, guys, last thing I want to mention, I put a playlist on the home page for just this book club because a lot of people were asking, like, where's the next video in the series? There's a playlist on the home page. I'll throw it up on the screen. You can just go there, and every new episode will be added to that, so it's easy to find. All right, thanks.